Chapter 3. Facts and Presuppositions. Whitehead, in commenting on philosophic method, wrote, quote, "So far as concerns methodology, the general use of the discussion will be that theory dictates method, and that any particular method is only applicable to theories of one correlate species. An analogous conclusion holds for the technical terms. This close relation of theory to method partly arises from the fact that the relevance of evidence depends on the theory which is dominating the discussion. This fact is the reason why dominant theories are also termed, quote, working hypotheses, end quote, end quote. We can agree that, quote, theory dictates methods, end quote, and that, quote, the relevance of evidence depends on the theory that is dominating the discussion, end quote. This is another way of saying that presuppositions determine or dictate what the facts shall be. Whitehead, in order to preserve knowledge as a possibility, broke to a degree with other philosophers to view the world as an experience process rather than atomistic particular sensations. In this experience process, Whitehead sought to know brute facts and discern in them a pattern of endurance in process whereby some kind of knowledge would be possible. In effect, he echoed Platonic ideas and sought to locate in process and its formlessness some kind of form. The problem which confronts all non-Christian philosophies and all ostensibly Christian philosophies which presuppose to any degree the autonomy of man in a world of brute factuality is very simply this: how can brute facts ever be anything more than brute facts? For a consistent and biblically governed faith, all the facts of nature and history are the creation of the triune God. The facts of nature and history are totally governed by the God who ordained them and created them, and who, by his eternal decree and comprehensive counsel, absolutely undergirds their every detail. All facts are thus God-given facts. As Van Til stated it, quote, all that may be known by man is already known by God, and it is already known by God because it is controlled by God, end quote. All knowledge, therefore, is of God-created and God-interpreted facts. This is not idealism. Idealism seeks to locate the meaning of facts within creation itself, and it presupposes that facts in themselves are both form or idea and matter. Thus, Cecil de Boer in 1953 charged Van Til with idealism because he insisted on the impossibility of knowledge if a philosopher were consistent to his presuppositions of brute facts. According to de Boer, quote, the new apologetics maintains that the unbelievers in rejecting supernatural revelation rejects the, quote, first premise, end quote, of all true reasoning and cannot therefore hope to come to a true conclusion. He may be as logical in his argumentation as he pleases, but since he is simply out of touch with reality, his reasoning cannot but end in sheer illusion. Therefore, he cannot really be said to, quote, know anything truly, end quote. In short, unless I, quote, know God truly, end quote, I cannot know anything truly. Anyway, it is evidently useless to argue that because a man does not accept the Christian religion, he cannot really, that is, ultimately, metaphysically distinguish an egg from a cucumber. That kind of thing gets one nowhere, and there is no earthly use for it except possibly as an undergraduate exercise in making purely nominal and academic distinctions, end quote. De Boer's charges were obviously ridiculous. A consistent creationism is the antithesis of idealism. Moreover, de Boer clearly conceded that Van Til is right, that a man who does not reason on strictly Christian grounds can know nothing if he confines himself to his premises. This is a point of inestimable importance. To call it simply, quote, an undergraduate exercise in making purely nominal and academic distinctions, end quote, is an amazing statement and a fine example of camel swallowing, Matthew 23:24. The history of modern philosophy witnesses to the fact that, on the premise of the autonomy of man in a world of brute factuality, knowledge becomes a critical problem and indeed impossible. Philosophy is not a game nor an undergraduate exercise. When philosophy, in developing the implications of its premises, is unable to account for the reality of our everyday experience and common knowledge, we have every right to question the validity of those premises. When we reject the God of Scripture and posit a universe of brute factuality, we do create for ourselves some very serious problems. The idea of brute factuality does eliminate the Creator God of Scripture, but it leaves us with a perhaps infinite number of brute facts, totally irrational and impervious to reason, having no pre-established pattern or meaning, and being thus essentially isolated and autonomous facts. As an existentialist, autonomous man can deny that he has any essence and God-given nature and determination. He may insist that he has being and must make or define his own essence. Then, however, all other men and all other facts in the universe are in the same status. They have no essence, no pre-established pattern, no meaning, and hence no definition. In such a situation, nothing can be known if a man is faithful to his presuppositions. The consistent Christian position must be a demand that men must be consistent to their basic starting point, to their presupposition. Their implicit metaphysical and epistemological principles will, if systematically carried out, require the unbeliever to admit his impasse. The point of Van Til's negative apologetics is to push the unbeliever to a recognition of his premises and of their inability to furnish him with any valid knowledge. The Christian must especially challenge the idea of neutrality. Quote, in spite of this claim to neutrality on the part of the non-Christian, the Reformed apologist must point out that every method, the supposedly neutral one no less than any other, presupposes either the truth or the falsity of Christian theism. End quote. Facts are what our presuppositions assume them to be. If our presupposition is consistently Christian, the facts we confront are God-created and are governed, like ourselves, by His predestinating counsel. If our presuppositions are grounded on an autonomous man in a world of brute factuality, then the reference point in all thinking is that omnipresent brute factuality. It is our presupposition that makes facts intelligible and determines what a fact is. Before we approach a quote-unquote fact, our presupposition has determined what constitutes a fact, so that when we ask what is a fact, we can answer the question only by looking at our presupposition. As Van Til has pointed out with reference to this question, quote, the answer to this question cannot be finally settled by any direct discussion of quote-unquote facts. It must, in the last analysis, be settled indirectly. The Christian apologist must place himself upon the position of his opponent, assuming the correctness of his method merely for argument's sake, in order to show him that on such a position, the facts are not facts, and the laws are not laws. He must also ask the non-Christian to place himself upon the Christian position for argument's sake, in order that he may be shown that only upon such a basis do facts and laws appear intelligible. To admit one's own presuppositions and to point out the presuppositions of others is therefore to maintain that all reasoning is, in the nature of the case, circular reasoning. The starting point, the method, and the conclusion are always involved in one another. End quote. The unbeliever does have valid knowledge because he does not think consistently in terms of his premises. He assumes a uniformity and order in nature. He proceeds on the presupposition that reality is not total irrationality, but does in fact have a pattern which is rational and comprehensible. As a result, he does gain knowledge by assuming that the world is what God made it to be, while at the same time denying God and creation. As Van Til notes, some object, saying, do you mean to assert that non-Christians do not discover truth by the methods they employ? The answer is, as Van Til points out, quote, nothing so absurd as that. The implication of the method here advocated is simply that non-Christians are never able and therefore never do employ their own methods consistently. End quote. The Christian does not attempt to prove that God exists, but to demonstrate that, apart from the presupposition of God, no proof is possible. The starting point of philosophy should not be man, as in Descartes and modern philosophy, cogito ergo sum, but God. Without the presupposition of God, there is no ground for distinguishing between one particular and another, because there would be no premise beyond autonomous man and brute factuality to establish a principle of differentiation and a pattern of meaning. Van Til has very ably illustrated this fact. Quote, over against this Christian theistic position, any non-Christian philosophy virtually denies the unity of truth. It may speak much of it and even seem to contend for it, as idealistic philosophers do, but in the last analysis, non-Christian philosophy is atomistic. This follows from the absolute separation between truth and reality that was introduced when Adam and Eve fell away from God. When Satan tempted Eve to eat of the forbidden fruit, he tried to persuade her that God's announcement of the consequences of such an act would not come true. That was tantamount to saying that no assertion in terms of a rational scheme could predict the course of movement of time-controlled reality. Reality, Satan practically urged upon man, was to be conceived of as something that is not under rational control. Every non-Christian philosophy makes the assumption made by Adam and Eve and is therefore irrationalistic. This irrationalism comes to most consistent expression in various forms of empiricism and pragmatism. In them, predication is frankly conceived of in atomistic terms. End quote. Thus, when man makes his reason an autonomous judge over all things, he also withdraws rationality from the universe in that it is no longer the handiwork of God, and therefore open to reason because the absolute rationality of God created and governed it. Man then sees himself as pure reason and the universe as pure brute factuality, irrational factuality. The problem then from Kant through Whitehead is to assert and establish some kind of valid correlativity between logic and fact, between the mind of man and a meaningless sea of factuality. The refuge of many thinkers, Lenin included, has been to confess the epistemological dilemma and take refuge in a, quote, naive realism, end quote. Lenin wrote in Materialism and Empirical Criticism, Critical Notes Concerning a Reactionary Philosophy, quote, the, quote, naive realism, end quote, of any healthy person who is not an inmate of an insane asylum or in the school of the idealist philosophers consists in this, that he believes reality, the environment and the things in it, to exist independently of his perception, independently of his conception of himself in particular and of his fellow men in general. Our sensation, our consciousness, is only a representation of the outer world, but it is obvious that although a representation cannot exist without someone for whom it is a representation, the represented thing exists independently of the one for whom it is a representation. The quote-unquote naive belief of mankind is consciously taken by materialism as the basis of its theory of knowledge, end quote. Except for some idealists and Christian scientists, Lenin has no one to disagree with him. What he is saying about, quote, naive realism, end quote, is that the world we perceive is assumed to be a real world. This we will grant him readily, because the real issue is that, quote, naive realism, end quote, is actually an act of faith. Rather than accept the God of Scripture, Lenin chose to accept a world whose existence, in terms of his epistemology, he could not prove. To that world he assigned the attributes of God, including an eternal decree or predestination, calling it instead the determinism of dialectical materialism. All the attributes of the mind of God, Lenin ascribed to materialism, and then found manifested in a historical process of which he was the voice. When we begin with God as the creator and governor of all things, we can account clearly and rationally for the world of, quote, naive realism, end quote. Without that God, we begin and end in a contradictory faith and pile miracle upon miracle in a vain attempt to account for a reality known to the village idiots. As Van Til observes, quote, it is impossible to reason on the basis of brute facts. Everyone who reasons about facts comes to those facts with a schematism into which he fits the facts. The real question is, therefore, into whose schematism the facts will fit. As between Christianity and its opponents, the question is whether our claim that Christianity is the only schematism into which the facts will fit is true or not. Christianity claims that unless we presuppose the existence of God, in whom, as the self-sufficient one, schematism and fact and reason apart from and prior to the existence of the world, are coterminous, we face the utterly unintelligible, quote, brute fact, end quote, end quote. For the consistent Christian thinker, because God is the maker of all things and their governor in terms of his eternal decree, there are no brute facts for God. With respect to his own person, God is totally self-conscious, and potentiality and actuality are one in him. There is no unconsciousness in God, nor any hidden and undeveloped possibilities. With regard to creation, quote, God's interpretation logically precedes the denotation and the connotation of all facts of which it consists, end quote. Instead of beginning with brute facts, we begin with the God who created all facts, and all facts are meaningful and open to reason. The Christian position makes science possible because it establishes the validity of a total pattern in all factuality. The only true explanation of every fact is in God, and therefore to operate on borrowed premises, to assume a pattern while failing to acknowledge either the pattern or its source, is to be inconsistent. The necessary self-existence of God must be our starting point. Quote, accordingly, the various hypotheses that are to be relevant to the explanation of phenomena must be consistent with this fundamental presupposition. God is the presupposition of the relevancy of any hypothesis, end quote. Let us again cite Van Til, whose work in this area puts all Christian thinkers in debt to him. Quote, it is important that we see the exact point at issue here. The Christian position is certainly not opposed to experimentation and observation. As Christians, we may make various hypotheses in explanation of certain phenomena. But these various hypotheses will always be, as far as we can tell, in accord with the presupposition of God as the ultimate explanation of all things. Our hypotheses will always be subordinate to the notion of God as the complete interpreter of all facts, and if we make our hypotheses about facts subordinate to this God, it follows that there are no brute facts to which we can appeal in corroboration of our hypotheses. We appeal to facts, but never to brute facts. We appeal to God-inspired facts, and this is simply another way of saying that we try to discover whether our hypothesis is really in accord with God's interpretation of facts. The ultimate test for the relevancy of our hypotheses is, therefore, their correspondence with God's interpretation of facts. True human interpretation is implication into God's interpretation. In contrast to this, the ordinary scientific method seeks to determine the relevancy of hypotheses by an appeal to brute facts. An ultimate chance is assumed as the matrix of facts. Then the chance collation of facts is taken as a rational tendency among those brute facts. And the relevancy of an hypothesis is determined by its correspondence to this, quote, rational tendency, end quote, in things. Thus, the circle is complete. We start with brute facts and we end with brute facts. We presuppose chance as God, and therefore conclude that the God of Christianity cannot exist. It is impossible to overemphasize the importance for Christians of seeing the difference between their position and the current scientific method on the 3 points that we have now considered. A Christian cannot allow the legitimacy of the ideal of complete comprehension. That this ideal is made a limiting rather than a constitutive concept does not improve matters, but, if possible, makes them worse. It clearly implies that God, as creative and constitutive of reality and of true human interpretation, is, from the outset, excluded. It means the elevation of chance to the place of God. Secondly, Christians cannot consistently allow the theoretical relevancy of every sort of hypothesis. This too implies an elevation of chance to the place of God. In the third place, Christians cannot allow the appeal to brute facts as a test of the relevancy of hypotheses. Once more, this implies the elevation of chance to the position of God. End quote. Modern science is built on borrowed capital. It began with Puritan and Reformed thinkers who made the tremendous growth of science possible by their assumption of the eternal and predestinating counsel of God undergirding all reality. This faith is denied in theory by modern science and assumed in practice. For the Christian, the universe manifests purpose because God created it and has a purpose for the universe. Quote, it follows also that every fact within the universe has a purpose or function to fulfill. Even that which we think of as mechanical has a purpose. Mechanical laws are, from the ultimate point of view, completely teleological. End quote. Instead of a universe or multiverse of brute factuality, in which there is no valid ground for assuming any relationship between one fact and another fact, the Christian thinker who is consistent to the presupposition of the Creator God of Scripture has a universe of interrelated facts whose principle of interpretation is in the sovereign and triune God. To assume that a sea of brute facts can give us anything more than brute facts is to believe, to cite Van Til's delightful illustration, that, quote, the addition of zeros will produce something more than zero, end quote. But there are no brute facts. They do not exist, except in the imagination of fallen man. There are only God-created facts, and all factuality, to be logically and rationally known and to be amenable to scientific investigation, requires the presupposition of the God of Scripture.